Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on how to access and use learning support funding for young people and adults. I'm Claire Howard, Chief Executive of Natspec, and I'm delighted that we have with us today Beej Kaczmarczyk from eMemoir, who's going to take us through all the different funding streams and particularly focusing on the non-high needs funded students. Some of you will be aware that Natspec are specialists in high needs, and we do have a training course, a one-day training course on high needs funding. We do have another webinar on high needs funding, and we do have a helpline. So Beej particularly is going to look at adult education budgets, learning support, apprenticeship funding. I believe we have got quite a few people on the line, and I'm hoping that you can all hear us well. I'm going to hand over to Beej. Please feel free to ask questions in the question pane as Beej is speaking. I'll be checking the questions and answers, and we'll be interrupting Beej as and when questions occur when they're relevant, and then we will do another question session at the end as well. So I'm now delighted to hand over to Beej for the session.
Thanks very much, Claire. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to Natspec members and other colleagues from other providers. As Claire says, this next 55 minutes or so, I'm going to look at some of the issues around how to access and make best use of learning support funding for young people and adults in different settings. So I'll be looking a wee bit about study programs. As Claire said, I will briefly go over some of the issues about high needs, but that's the subject, obviously, of much more training that you can get from Natspec. My focus is going to be also on adults funded either through the adult education budget or through loans. And then I'm going to finish off by looking at some of the issues around the funding of apprentices. That's both young apprentices and adults. So that's the sort of theme for today. I think it's always useful to start off by just looking at some definitions. I think because we often now talk about learning support as opposed to learner support, which is more to do with financial support, I think it's sometimes useful to go back to the fact that originally, and this is going back to the days of the Further Education Funding Council and the Learning and Skills Council, was the word additional that was there before, because basically it's about the funding that's available that supports an individual over and above that which is normally provided in the standard learning program that leads to the learning goal. So if the learning goal is independent living, if it's about getting a level 2 qualification, an entry level qualification or apprenticeship, this is that which would be normally provided to learners is known as maintenance, and additional learning support is anything above that. The other thing to note, by the way, in England is that ALS is only available to learners on funded programs. So we're talking here about study programs, apprenticeships, adult education budget, etc., and not any other programs that might be funded out of commercial income or through purely through fees. And remember, this is about not only retaining learners and helping them achieve their goals, this is also significantly about how learners can access and engage in learning. And that need can arise either from a learning difficulty and or a disability, or from support required to access any type of program or employment which might arise from literacy, numeracy or language support requirements. And a question I often get is, can we use learning support, for example, to support ESOL learners? And the answer is yes, if that helps them to achieve their ESOL learning aim or qualification. So I think sometimes it's worthwhile thinking about those definitions, and whatever context you're in, whether you're in a general FE college, local authority, training provider, the voluntary sector, or in a specialist college, that those definitions hold for all those learners. So I'm going to look now at what is the funding that's available for young people and adults. Well, for 16 to 18-year-olds, and this includes those who will often be 19 when they finish the program, the funding for learning support is part of what we call the funding allocation and methodology, and that's been there since 2013. So we're now into the 7th year of that methodology. After no increase in the core funding for young people, we've seen an increase in funding this year. So that will take those core learners who are 16 and 17 doing a program of at least 540 planned hours from 4,000 to 4,188. And that's obviously important for all your learners, for their core funding. In other words, the funding before we start applying either a disadvantage uplift or any learning support needs. What is important to note is that all of those learners who meet the requirements to be a 16, 17 or 18-year-old starter, and that also includes 19 up to 25 with an educational healthcare plan, is that they're also entitled on top of their core funding to what we call disadvantaged block 2 funding, which I want to spend a bit of time with you, which is based on prior attainment in English and Maths. That's a GCSE English and Maths attainment at the end of year 11. And that is up to £480 per subject. That's for English, and £480 for Maths. For full-time students, it's less pro rata for part-time students. And obviously on top of that is the high needs funding, where learning support costs exceed £6,000 in an academic year, and I'll come back to that. So the 16 to 18 funding for learning support is part and parcel of the allocation to you as an institution, and you should have got your allocations by the end of January. Some of you will be getting it by the end of this month, if not March. And it's also part of the methodology, and there's no change on that methodology. I know that one of you has already asked me a question about how this applies to T-levels. I'll cover that in a few moments with you. T-level learners, that's level 3 learners next year on any one of the T-level pathways, will also be eligible to draw down funding through their core, through the disadvantaged block 2, and where it's appropriate, through high needs funding. The focus of very much the second part of this webinar is the funding that's available for adults, and that's coming out of what we call the adult education budget. That's a standard rate of £150 per learner per month recorded in the ILR. I'll show you how that's done. And any learner whose learning support cost in any month come to more than £150, and you've got evidence of that that can stand up to audit, you claim that funding through the earnings adjustment statement. If you're not listening in as a management information or data expert, have a chat with your MI manager or data manager about how the earnings adjustment statement works. I'll give you a little bit of help on that as well in the course of this session. The other thing to note, and again, I often talk to learning support managers in general FE, local authorities, and in the private training providers, is that any adult aged 19 and over who's funded their core program through a loan, an advanced learner loan, these are level 3 and above programs, is also entitled to be supported through what we call the Loans Bursary Fund. And again, how you access that, and for example, if you need to increase it, then the procedure for that is something which is, again, ask your MI manager, but I'll cover a little bit on that with you today. And the last group of learners is apprentices. Now, whether they're 16, 17 or 18 apprentices in terms of age, or 19 and over, they're all entitled, if they have an individual need, which they might have disclosed in some cases to you, which you've assessed, to a minimum of £150 per month that you claim through the ILR. And then if you need, again, any more than that in a month, you can claim that as what we call excess support through the earnings adjustment statement. By the way, all of these things that I've talked about here, which relate to excess support, they are still part of your allocation or your contract if you're not a grant funded provider. And the other thing to note is that with a lot of learners on things like supported internships, there is also access to work funding, by the way, which extends to include apprentices. And I know that some of the specialist providers, you might be also using access to work to claim funding where there are quite exceptionally high costs, very often well over £19,000 a year. So I'll look a little bit at access to work. So those are basically the main elements of funding, which I'm going to look at with you for the next 40 to 45 minutes. Now, just focusing on young people, how many of you in the audience, would just simply through a show of hands, have got young people that you are claiming funding for through learning support funding as part of the 16 to 18 funding formula? This can include your high needs learners, but also those learners which the costs of support are less than £6,000 a year. So how many of you do actually have 16 to 19-year-old learners claiming learning support And that can also include 19 to 25-year-olds that have an education healthcare plan whose additional support costs, again, come to more than £6,000 a year. Now, remember, the first category of learners is a lot of learners who don't cross that threshold of 6,000, and that can often be quite significant numbers in a general FE college or a training provider. And the second group are those which are 16 to 18 and the 19 to 25-year-olds. And don't forget, if you're 16 to 18, you can be a high needs learner without an education healthcare plan. If you're 19 to 25, you must have an education healthcare plan. But the key driver here, the key determinant is, do those additional support costs come to £6,000 and more in any 1 year? And could I also remind you, you can claim high needs funding for those categories of learners, even if they're not full-time, but if their programme would have come to and their support would have come to more than £6,000 if it was provided over a full academic year. And we've had part-time students whose additional learning support costs come to more than £6,000, even though they're only with you maybe for 7/12 of the year or half of the year. So the first group is a very general group that have got individual needs, sometimes with an education health plan, sometimes without. But the key thing is the support costs are less than 6,000, and that's all provided through the national funding formula and through disadvantaged funding, not through the high needs block. And it's that I'm going to focus on primarily today with you. So if you've got a learner next year of 16, 17 or 18, and you've assessed that they've got individual needs that will cost less than 6,000, how are you going to fund it? Well, the disadvantaged funding, better known as Block 2 disadvantaged funding based on prior attainment, is your key source of funding. But not to ignore Block 1, which is based on postal codes, because you often find that there are postal code differences which often relate to low levels of income, low levels of prior attainment, which of course come into your institution as a block, known as Block 1, along with Block 2, which make up the disadvantaged funding. And they're all part of the formula. So when you start to look at some of your 16, 17 and 18-year-olds, you're looking at £4,188 if they're 16, 17-year-old for their core programme. That's the delivery of a programme of 548 plus hours. But on top of that, you will often be adding Block 1 funding, which is postal code driven, that's economic deprivation, and also Block 2 prior attainment, which is really a proxy for low cost additional learning support. So I'm going to spend a wee bit of time looking at that Block 2. So that disadvantaged funding, as I said, is made up of the disadvantaged funding driven by postal codes. So roughly 27% of postal codes in England would generate some additional funding based on the index of multiple deprivation. Block 2 is based on prior attainment in GCSE English and Maths. Now that is really a proxy for your low cost learning support, anything that's less than £6,000. Now it takes no account of any historic patterns you've had of low cost spending on learning support. But essentially it's using English and Maths prior attainment. In other words, if the learner hasn't yet achieved grade 4 to 9 at the end of key stage 4, you will be using that not to fund English and Maths qualifications, because that's already funded out of their core, but to fund support for those learners to achieve their learning goals. Now, this support might be needed because they've got low levels of literacy and numeracy. So you might want to create a different class size, a much smaller class size because they're coming in at entry level 1, for example, or you might use it to put additional support into the classroom through your classroom support model, or you might use it to fund specialist support if those learners have got learning disabilities, learning difficulties and or disabilities. But essentially Block 2 is the first port of call, in addition to the other sources of funding, for low cost learning support. And I think that, again, if you can see that in your organisation through the allocation is giving you a substantial resource that comes into the institution, then it's how you get that out of the institution through, for example, your budgeting policies or whatever. The principle, therefore, is that this comes as a single budget that institutions can use any way they see fit. So it's not ring-fenced to learning support. Block 2 and Block 1, both Block 1 and Block 2 of disadvantaged funding, are not ring-fenced. The institution can spend it and the way it sees best fit to deliver an improvement in participation, retention and achievement. So it comes to you and it's paid to you each month on profile if you're grant funded, for example, a college, a local authority, or on profiled based on what you spent in the previous month if you're independent learning provider or funded through a contract. Now, for me, the most important thing here is if you're a learning support manager, is how you can make a business case for your share of this funding. Because if I know that, for example, I've got 2,000 learners and on average, they either don't have English or don't have maths, then that's 2,000 incidents of £480. That's just less than £1 million that's come into the college for Block 2. How do I get hold of a part of that million? Because it's not ring-fenced to learning support, remember that. It's about business cases. It's about how many learners have we got that we've identified a need for? What would be the types of needs that we're trying to meet? How do we cost those needs? And if we get our share of the resource, what's the impact on participation? Will we keep the learners? Will we get them in the first place? Will we keep them? Will they learn will they learn to the target? And will we get good achievement rates and good progression? So I think it's important that you do make the business case for your share of that Block 2 funding. Otherwise, you'll be at the vagaries of how it's dispersed within your institution. And I think, again, from what a couple of you have said to me already, that's one of the key things you've got to maybe improve or develop. So the disadvantaged funding rates, Block 2 is based on outturn data from 1819. Block 1 funding is based on that same outturn data. We're not using any matched data anymore. So it's the outturn data from 1819 that determines how much Block 2 funding you're getting. As I said, it's £480 for a full-time learner. That's a learner or the programme of at least 540 hours. And then it's pro rata for any of your part-time students. Those tables are available within the guidance notes for this. So you can see there that for any learners next year who are not on T levels, it's a standard £480 for English and £480 for maths. By the way, any of you have got T level learners that don't have a GCSE grade 4 to 9 when they entered into your institution, that payment is slightly higher at £650 per subject. So again, you can measure the number of incidents of that. And as I said, if you've got in your institution, you know, a significant amount of Block 2 funding, then here's an example. I've got, you know, as I said, £480 per learner. I've got 2,000 incidents. Some of those learners might not have both English and maths, in which case it's £960 for that learner, as opposed to £480 if it's either or. Think about £960,000. If you got the whole of that budget, how many hours of classroom support could you buy at, say, an average of £25 an hour? You know, you're getting almost 24,000, you know, hours. So you can start to see, or so they say, more than that, depending on what your basic rate funding is. You'd get about 24,000 hours if, sorry, I've got to get my sums right, 2,400 hours if it was an average of £40 an hour, or whatever, right? So try and work that out. If you've got a standard rate, and I'll just do my sums again because I got confused there. If I was even charging it out at £40 an hour, it would give me 24,000 hours. So that's a fair chunk of hours that you would have available if you were just putting classroom support. So how many of you, so the key questions here for you to take away, not maybe to discuss now, but certainly, you know, to think about in your teams is how is your Block 2 funding allocated within your institution? Once your institution gets that allocation, which in many cases it got by the end of January, how much of that is then used to support those learners that haven't got English and maths grade 4 to 9, not to run the programme? The English and maths should not be funded out of it. This is funded out of the core funding, the 4,188. For things like smaller class size, you can still use that. Remember the way you could calculate if you're using the small class size factor, additional workshops, maybe a maths and English person to sit in on the vocational studies, etc. But it's a range of needs that can be met out of this funding. And that is particularly when you're starting to get learners who, if you did your calculations, how many learners in your institution are below 6,000, but say, using an arbitrary figure, over £4,000? Because if you've got a learner whose learning support costs are between £4,000 and £5,999, they are being funded out of Block 2. And I think that question I've raised is how many of those learners, particularly if you're getting more complex needs. So how you make a business case is critical. And I've talked about, don't just say, I need it, say, I need it for the following reasons, and here are going to be the benefits, the impacts on retention, achievement, or closing, for example, the attainment gap. If you've got evidence from your self-assessment process that spending learning support on a young person has benefited them, it's had this impact, it's closed the attainment gap, then that's a good way of making the business case. So are there any questions about Block 2 funding before we move on? Any questions there that you've got, Claire?
Just checking the question pane. No, I don't think so. There's no specific questions, but the one that generally gets tend to asked during our sessions is in terms of that disadvantage funding. What sort of top tips have you got for people to go and speak to finance managers or others to stop it all being swallowed up for English and maths exams?
Well, my advice is, first of all, know how much it is. So have a look at your institution's allocation. That's all public, and certainly it should be shared inside your institution. So find out what the allocation is, because you'll find there's a 16, 17, 18-year-old allocation from the ESFA. It will tell you how much Block 1 is. It will tell you how much Block 2 is. It also tells you how many learners you're going to get high needs support for at 6,000. That's all part of that. And then say, well, if I know what the quantum is, then, you know, you've got have some estimate of last year's need and how the benefits of that translated into supporting those learners in terms of improvements in retention, improvements in achievement, closing the attainment gap, value added, distance traveled, progression onto the next level. Have all of that data. But my basic advice is you've got to know how much is available in the first place and then make your case for it, because other people will make the case to say we could use some of that for tutorial, or we could use some of that for careers. You know, there are other claims on it. So know what the quantum is and then make the case. And my advice always was don't whinge, you know, because that's not going to help, particularly if you're wanting to make a good business case. It's important to highlight some very good factual information. Yep.
Thank you. I'll put the link to where that information is published. I'll put that in the chat pane in the next few minutes. Thanks, Beej.
Oh, brilliant. I'm going to say a couple of words about high needs, because Claire said that high needs is something that could be covered through other webinars, etc. But I think most of you are aware that high needs learners are those whose additional costs come to more than £6,000. So it includes young people, 16, 17 and 18-year-olds, and also 19 up to 25-year-olds. They must, of course, have an education healthcare plan. Now, the issue here is that for many of you, high needs funding is not just about the elements which are based on place numbers. The place numbers reflects usually the lag number effect of how many learners you had last year. The key thing is by the middle of November, you had to, through your local authority, what we call the provider local authority, made the case for any changes in place numbers. That should have been done, and you would have now had the first outcomes of those place number requests. They were publicised a few weeks ago. The Block 3 funding, what we call the Element 3, is much more about this negotiation between yourself and the local authorities from which those learners come. So the elements of funding, Element 1 is the core funding, which almost all the assumptions for now in the guidance is for full-time learners, it's basically the funding for the core element plus the disadvantage funding. And we're using a figure there of roughly 5,200. So I'm getting roughly 5,200 for each full-time learner, Element 1. Element 2 is the 6,000, and then Element 3, and again, Element 2 comes through the allocation. Element 3 is attached to an individual learner, and of course that is the top-up funding. So I won't spend any more time than that, but the key thing to note here is that place-led funding is not attached to individual named learners or a place. Top-up funding is related to an individual, and it's that's the subject of discussion with your local authority. So I've put some slides together which you can reflect on in your own time to make sure you know I've covered the same sort of things as you would already understand. But again, I pose some questions. What's happened to the number of high needs students? I think all the data shows that those numbers are going up, because we can see that as evidence through concern about the SEND, concern that you've expressed, and obviously the increase in place numbers. How do you then allocate? Because remember, you're not just allocating the top-up funding, it's how is element 2 also allocated. And I see this as a global sum, because obviously we need to have across all of our learners a distribution of funds that cover their individual needs. So is your high needs funding just being specifically attached to individual learners? How is your place funding being used? And are you dispersing some of the funding to make sure everyone gets a bit of something, even if the top-up funding hasn't been yet agreed with the home authority? And that also relates to the discussions you might have with the local authorities, and the funding and evaluation arrangements will differ by each local authority. But I think I'd like to park that for the moment, and then if there are any questions at the very end, we'll pick them up. If not, obviously, get in touch with Claire after this webinar. What I do want to focus on is about adults, because adults and apprentices seem to be the two groups that have got least, I think, provision for their individual needs, even though they are covered by all the legislation that's around, the equality legislation. The SEND goes up to the age of 25. And I think here we've got to say that the ESFA basically says that those learners who are not covered by the first group of learners that we looked at this afternoon, so 16, 17 and 18-year-olds, the 19 to 25-year-olds with education and healthcare plans, they are basically being funded through the adult education budget. And that's being used for all adults 19 and over and under 25 who are not subject to an education and healthcare plan. Any adult aged 25 and over are covered by the adult education budget, and the only exceptions are apprentices who have got their own separate block of funding, not the adult education budget. So the ESFA funds those adults on what we call classroom-based provision through the AAB, and the ESFA funds apprentices through quite a separate funding, and that includes 16, 17 and 18-year-olds as well as 19-year-olds. And for most of your adults, it's at £150 per month if a need's being identified. And then on the ILR, you identify the learner. You must identify what the learning aim is. And if they've got more than one, you've got to identify the learning aim. And if they've got a learning need, which either they've disclosed and you've assessed, or you've assessed without them disclosing, then you will have to put what that particular need is. And if there's more than one need, which one is the primary one. All of that is part and parcel of the process that you would agree with your MI team. If the learner needs any more support than £150 per month, which is automatic through the ILR, it's an automatic figure, then you've got to have what we call an excess learning support claim, which is done through the earnings adjustment statement. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So, for example, here's one learner on a functional skills program. You'll see that in month 4 and 5, we're not going to be claiming any learning support, because we're going to get them started with a bit of learning support in month 1 and 2 and 3. And then just before they're due to do the assessments, we'll put that support back in month 6 and 7. So you'd have learning support beginning and ending in month 1, ending in month 3, and then beginning again in month 6 and ending in month 7. You can have learning support that goes all the way through. It's up to whatever model you think works best for that learner. Now, for those months that we're providing learning support, we've actually got an actual cost figure. And it always defaults to 150 unless the actual cost is more than 150. So in month 1 and 2, it's more. And I've got claims forms, I've got hour sheets to evidence that. And in month 7, it's actually double what we would normally intend to do because of the fact that we're putting in some help in preparation for the actual assessment. So we can see that in each one of month 1, 2, 6 and 7, there's an excess learning support claim evidenced by documents, and that's giving us the additional support that we need to help this learner, which is in this case £400. Now that would then be claimed through the earnings adjustment statement. Now, one of you has posed a question, do we have to then go back to the ESFA to get that? No, it is part of the total allocation in your AEB. So when you get the adult education budget from the ESFA, it's a single line budget. It doesn't break down, what's learning support. It will just simply say, here's your total budget, 2.5 million. It might give you some, if it's co-funded through ESF, it might reduce it to balance out with the ESF that you're getting separately. But what's critical there is then the learning support team have got to say, well, out of that 2.5 million, historically, we've always needed X amount of learning support for Y number of learners. Now, if the number of learners is more than Y, you might therefore make a claim for more out of your total AAB allocation. If the current number of learners that you're looking to give learning support to are adults is less than Y, you might be reducing it. But it all depends on the nature of support, because you might find that you've got more adults who might have counselling needs, who might have mental health needs, etc., and they have to be funded out of all of this support. So the model basically says that anything up to 19,000 per year for individual learner, using whatever cost base you're using, that must be supported out of your allocation. If you find that you're going to have a learner who's going to cost you more than £19,000, this is just for the learning support, this is an adult, and this would be with significant learning needs and or disabilities, then you have to put a claim in directly to the ESFA for what we call exceptional learning support. This is not the same as excess learning support, which you do through the earnings adjustment statement. Now, if they're 19 to 24 and their learning support costs come to more than 19,000, the first question the ESFA is going to ask you is, well, why isn't this person not got an education and healthcare plan? Because if they're 19 to 24 when they start the program and their support costs are that high, then the argument is they should not be funded out of your AEB, they should be funded out of your 16 to 19 allocation under that category of 19 up to 25 with an education and healthcare plan. So you must confirm why they haven't got an education and healthcare plan. It could be because the local authority has a line at 19 or hasn't got resources, or it's just refused to do the plan. That, I think, can be quite a contentious area, and we've certainly had instances of learners who are adults who are on adult funded programs, say access to HE, GCSE, retakes, etc., level 2, first level 2 programs, whose learning support costs have got very close to 19,000, who haven't got education and healthcare plans, and we're funding them through the AB, rather than if they were over £6,000, we should have been funding them through the 16 to 19 allocation. So, and this, as I said, is all about meeting the requirements not only of the SEND up to the age of 25, but more generally the Equality Act. Now, what's confusing matters for some of you now, and again, can we just show it? How many of you are in a combined, a mayoral combined authority, such as Liverpool, Greater Manchester, Greater London, Tees Valley, West Midlands, Northamptonshire, is it Peterborough, sorry, I've forgotten which the other ones are. If you're in a combined authority, and obviously next year this is north of Tyne as well, then you've got a slightly more complex model. Part of your AEB, including learning support, it's not a separate heading, will come to you from the combined authority for any residents of that combined authority. And if you've got people that you are supporting on adult education programs who are not within the combined authority, in other words, residents outside, that's coming to you as ESFA. Now, those two separate sources of funding are your total AEB, and therefore each will have an element of learning support in them. They're not identified separately. Most of the combined authorities are using the grant-funded approach. They're taking a proportion out that isn't your residents, and then they're giving you that only what covers people who are resident within the combined authority. So we've got some show of hands there. A fair number of you are in a combined authority. If all of your residents are within the combined authority in your ILR and none of them are outside, then 100% of your AEB is coming to you from the combined authority and nothing from the ESFA. The exceptions to that would always be traineeships. So if you've got 19 to 24 traineeships, they're still funded by the ESFA.
Beej, can I just come in here a second? There's a couple of questions that came in. I was just I just left the webinar for a moment there, so I hope you may have already answered this one, but from Jaspal, what is the maximum amount that can be claimed per learner on the EAS for adult learners aged 25 plus, so over 25?
The figure is anything up to £19,000. The ceiling of what we call exceptional learning support is still 19,000. So on the earnings adjustment statement, say I've got the person for 7 months at £150. That's 7 times 150 would be just over 1,000. If I know that the actual learning support costs come to £10,000, I could claim 9,000 through the earnings adjustment statement. The maximum I can claim is the figure, the difference between what I can claim on the ILR and the 19,000 ceiling. Does that make sense? Yeah. So anything up to £19,000 less the number of months that I've been claiming the £150 at. See, the £150 is automatically claimed through the ILR, depending on how many months you want to claim it, depending on the length of the course. The difference between that and 19,000 is basically the maximum you can claim through the earnings adjustment statement.
Yeah, and those ILR monthly returns are you have to complete every ILR return, don't you? So for some of our listeners will only be used to completing an RO4 or RO6 and RO10. It's every month, isn't it, for that one, for the £150?
I mean, if you what you do on the ILR is once you've identified the learner and checked they're eligible, and then check the learning aim. If there's no learning aim attached to the learner, by the way, you can't claim learning support. Could I just say, because even learners who are still doing their functional skills, actually you can claim learning support if they've completed the functional skills program but haven't yet done the test. It's interesting, isn't it? That's the only exception to this, but normally if there's no learning aim, we can't attach learning support to that learner. The learning support, you then say when's it going to start and when it's going to finish. If you say it's going to start and finish and there's 8 months, then the system will automatically claim 8 times £150, and that will come out of the total allocation to your institution. If any one of those months you want to claim more than £150 for that particular month, because you know you're going to maybe have to front load it or back end load it, like that model, that's claimed through the earnings adjustment statement. The earnings adjustment statement is done by your MI team. They might submit that to the ESFA periodically, say every 3 months, every 6 months, maybe at the end of the year. But that total amount of earnings adjustment still comes out of the AEB allocation or contract that your institution has. This is not additional funding that would suddenly come in from the ESFA. The only exception to that is if any of your learners become what we call exceptional learning support.
Okay.
Is that okay?
And that's great. One more question from Charlotte Croucher. If they turn 25 in the academic year, will the funding stop or stay in place until the end of the year if they don't have any HCP?
If they don't have it. Right, I mean, the assumption is that they'll be before 25, before the start of the programme. If they were 19 up to 24 when they started the programme, the additional funding through the 16 to 19 funding formula carries on until they complete their programme. So that's assuming no longer than 25 years old, yeah? If they know that they're going to be more than 25 when they start the program, they automatically are funded through the AEB, as long as you've got an AEB allocation. Now, some of you might be doing this as subcontractors. In other words, an allocation goes to the primary, the main provider, and then you're doing some of the delivery. That might be the instance where you've got, even if you haven't got an AEB contract, you'd certainly have to be on the register of training organisations to get that. So I know some of you are subcontractors to a directly funded provider for adult education budget. Similarly, for loans, by the way, because what I've just said for AEB also applies to a learner whose primary learning aim, which might be a level 3 or 4 diploma, is funded by a loan. Now, if they're funded by a loan, the institution has what we call a loans facility, which limits how many learners they can take on, although that's reviewed now at every performance management point. But they must also indicate how many additional bits of funding they might need for any loan-funded learner that can cover things like hardship costs, learning support costs, childcare costs, residential costs, etc. And this is not part of the loans facility. It's called the Loans Bursary Fund. Again, it's not an entitlement, by the way. You have to have evidence of need and of total spend by a learner. Now, most of you listening in today are grant funded. So if you're grant funded, this comes to you at £150 per month per learner that you're claiming for, and it will be part of a Loans Bursary Fund allocation that you get. If you find that that Loans Bursary Fund facility, not allocation, facility is not enough, you've got to make sure you put in a case for saying it's not enough. Now, if you know that you're already spending right up to it, and at the performance management point, say after 6 months, all the evidence is you're going to exceed it, then you used to have to make a case for it. As long as you've got the evidence to back it up, they will often give you more. But again, it's all limited by how much is in the loans, the total loans facility. Can I just say the total loans facility is about £480 million this year. We're not going to spend it. So there is always that capacity for some growth. Now, if you're a college or local authority or grant funded by another, the way you claim it is by £150 to the ILR per month for each learner. And if in any month you need to spend more than £150, you can use the earnings adjustment statement to claim any excess. If you're not funded by grant, but through a contract, you've got to identify which one of those 3 categories the learner is, either rate 1, rate 2, or rate 3. You can only claim one of those rates in a month. So if it's learning support, and you know you're going to be giving them learning support for each one of the months they're with you, you'd be category B, £150. If you know it's learning support plus childcare, you can claim rate 3. You wouldn't claim rate 2 and 3. Do you know what I'm getting at? And you might find that you might in some months have to provide exceptional support because of residential. So they might be on rate 3 in month 1, but back to rate 2 in month 2, right through to the end of the program. So again, it's very similar to the adult education budget. But one thing that the rules on loan funded learners do, remember these are 19 and over, quite a lot of these could be your access to HE learners, they could be learners on, accountancy programs or whatever. Again, they're entitled to have their needs identified and assessed. They might disclose them to you as part of the initial assessment and induction. You've then got to carry out a thorough assessment to identify the support they need. You then got to make sure you put a plan in place, all of the best practice that we talked about there, and then on the learner file, what used to be called the learner agreement, you've got to record what the learning needs are, how you're going to meet them, and then keep evidence of what you've actually done, because this could be subject to audit. And again, if you still need support for the learner, even though they've passed their planned end date, you can again still show evidence that they passed their planned end date, they still haven't achieved the full diploma or whatever, we're going to give them a bit of support, as long as learning is still going on. So again, loan funded learners, and this is a separate facility, you must not merge the loan funded funding with your adult education budget funding and then via between them. That's forbidden, right? These are quite distinct learners, and auditors would pick that up. So are there any questions about the loan funded provision? I mean, those of you who've got loan funded learners, if you know they've got individual needs, make sure at the next performance management point, you've got evidence to show that you might need more funding. Obviously, if you know that in advance that you're going to need more funding, you'd certainly make the case for it. As long as you've got evidence of need, that's the key thing. So no questions there on loan funding. Can I just ask, by the way, how many of you are claiming learning support for loan funded learners out of the number of people attending? Can we just have a show of hands there? How many of you are claiming loans bursary funding for loan funded learners? Okay, that's good. Yeah, as long as you've got loan funded learners. Okay, and the earnings adjustment statement, which I've mentioned twice now, to be used with adult education budget and to be used with loan funded learners, is the process that you use for claiming excess learning support, but also if you need to claim for any individual adult whose learning support cost, not their core training program, not the cost of their program, is coming to more than 19,000, then you've got to claim that through the earnings adjustment statement. Now, this applies to classroom-based adult learners, the advanced learner loans bursary, and by the way, as you'll see in a minute, we also use it for apprentices. That's all ages, by the way. Again, the earnings adjustment statement, because you're paid on profile if you're grant funded, general FE, local authority, and some voluntary sector organisations, you have to submit that roughly every quarter because it's coming out of your total allocation or your total bursary fund. If you're a training provider, you're paid on actuals, you've got to submit the earnings adjustment statement every month. And then if you put it in 1 month, it'll be paid the following, it'll come to you in your payment the following month out of the total value of your contract. So again, that's how the process works. Can I just advise those of you who have never come across the earnings adjustment statement, put one of the action points from today, in addition to the one about making sure you understand how much your block 2 funding, is a disadvantaged funding. The second action point for you is have a chat with your MI manager about the earnings adjustment statement and make sure you start claiming it. As long as you've got evidence that the cost is more than £150 per month. Now, learning support for apprentices is actually contained with all the apprenticeship legislation. So this is about making reasonable adjustments for apprentices of all ages with a learning difficulty and or disability where this affects their ability to continue. There's no distinction because they're work-based learning, they still have the same entitlements. And by the way, can you include where it might include the cost of endpoint assessment? If they're on an apprenticeship standard, where they might have to do an endpoint assessment, which can involve written exams, interviews, etc. If you know you need to provide additional support to get them there, as well as meeting the need during the endpoint assessment, then I think you've got to make sure you claim the funding. But of course, the funding really has got to cover the period up to the point where they do the endpoint assessment. And I think also to make sure that, you know, a lot of those apprentices will not actually, you'll not identify their learning difficulty or disability until they may be well into the program. You know, in some cases they might self-declare. But I think you've got to make sure that there is a proper diagnosis of the need, even if it's a self-declaration. The same rules apply, by the way, as to all of the other learners we've talked about. It's not to be used for everyday difficulties. You know, I'm struggling with this concept or whatever. Well, that's got to be sorted out through the core funding. Now, remember, apprentices, the price that's negotiated between you, the provider, and the employer for an apprentice is dependent on the bands that are available there. So starting at, you know, roughly £2,000 per learner up to £27,000 or so, depending on what size the framework or standard is. And that's the core funding. This is the funding that's separate. Now, in this case, the requirement for all apprenticeship providers is to follow that process that we've got. And in the evidence pack, what you have for each apprentice, you've got an evidence pack that shows start points for that learner, the initial assessment, diagnostic assessment, any other information about what the learner is intending to do, how much prior learning they've got, what their additional needs are, what the nature of those needs are, how they're going to be missed. That's all got to be recorded for each apprentice. And one of you has already put up a problem, which is, well, we don't look after, we're ALS in the college, we don't look after ALS for apprentices. Well, how do you know that the apprentices are getting the same degree of support and level of support as a classroom-based learner, either through the 16 to 19 funding formula or through the adult education budget or loans? The same principles have got to apply, because if I was inspecting you, I'd be saying, learning support, you might have high needs apprentices, you might have high needs adults. How are you making sure that their needs are being met? appropriately through whatever the funding formula is. So again, it's £150 per month that's paid. Now, here it's not part of the negotiation of a price with the employer. Your apprenticeship team might negotiate how much it's going to cost to deliver the learning program, the training program, and endpoint assessment for an apprentice. How often will they also be working out how much the learning support costs? That you have to do that. Now, either you train up your workplace tutors to do that, or every learner that's identified, whether they be apprentice or not, is referred to you, the central ALS team. Whichever system you've got to be able to start to identify that that apprentice on the ILR has got an individual need. We've assessed it, and we're going to claim £150 per month on that learner, and that might be every month, or it could be depending on when they're coming in to do their off-the-job training. If it's going to cost more than £150 in any month to support an apprentice, you've got to claim that through excess learning support, but you must have the evidence how much it cost in that month. And then if it comes to, and that's done through the earnings adjustment statement, if it's more than 19,000, you've also got to claim exceptional learning support. And the first question they'll ask is, why has this person not got an education and health care plan if they're aged, between 16 and 25, but on an apprenticeship program? So the apprenticeship funding is coming directly to you from the ESFA against what you're claiming through the SFA. And it's not part of the price that you negotiate with the employer. Now, don't forget, you're already getting incentive payments for employing, for taking on 16 to 18-year-old apprentices. They get £2,000 incentive payment. 1,000 goes to you, the provider, and 1,000 goes to the employer. That's because of the additional cost associated with enrolling and working with younger apprentices who have got very little work experience. And that also extends to any 19 to 24-year apprentice who's got an education and health care plan. So there's an extra £2,000 coming to you, the provider. You share some of that with the employer, but to remember that that is another element of the support that you've got for those apprentices, plus the learning support that you're claiming through the ILR and through excess learning support. And by the way, that can also help them to achieve English and maths if they haven't yet achieved it. Even if the apprenticeship program end date has been achieved, you can claim learning support to help them with their English and maths after the end of their planned end date for their actual apprenticeship program. Learning support, by the way, is always fully funded, and the employer is not required to contribute anything towards the cost. We know that for adults, for example, the employers are asked to contribute a small proportion of the cost of training and assessment. And this is not part of the employer's digital account. So this is not something that the employers have taken off them that they then have to spend back with you. This is coming directly from the ESFA. So can I just ask, how many of you are aware of how much learning support your apprentices are getting, of either in terms of the amount of support or the amount of money, and you're an actually active party in determining that? Or is it done by someone else in your organisation, for example, work-based learning team or apprenticeship team? So how many of you directly control this source of funding? Show of hands there, Claire?
There's quite a lot there, actually, yeah, more than before.
But that's better. That is better, because I think if we go back 2 or 3 years, Claire, that was my biggest concern, is how often we were reporting apprentices not completing their programs, struggling to achieve what was in their apprenticeship because they didn't have either the needs identified, or worse still, had the needs identified but not actually delivered because of the lack of capacity or lack of understanding of the apprenticeship team. You cannot make that argument now. Any learner, irrespective of the source of funding, as long as it's publicly funded, has got to have the highest and best level of support they can get through, whatever the context is for their learning.
Yeah. I've got a couple of questions on apprentices, Beej, if this is a good time for those. The first one, I think the answer is going to be yes, but can I just check with you? Funding is the same for all apprentices, including those with the HCPs, unless they're high need funded. Is that true?
It's the same for all. It's got to be driven by what you have calculated the cost of support is going to be required.
Yeah. So unless they're high needs funded, if they've got an EHCP, it's going to be the same as every other apprentice.
I mean, if they're high needs, if they're over £6,000, there's no different source of funding. You have to claim all of that through excess learning support.
They're funded through.
The question that will be asked by, I suppose, by auditors is, why haven't they got an education healthcare plan if they're 19 to 25 to 24? They should really have a plan, and then that plan will be met by the AEB or by the apprenticeship funding.
And then we've got somebody else saying, I have an apprentice who has past the end date, but has not passed level 2 functional skills maths. So is the classroom-based funding still available for that learner?
You can claim, you've got to claim the funding for them through the apprenticeship funding. Because although they haven't finished, if they finished the program but not yet achieved the necessary level of English and maths, then that means you will have, the ILR will still be open for them because they haven't completed it. Then for each month that you're providing support, claim £150 through the ILR. And if you find that you need to put more than 150, you can claim it through the earnings adjustment statement. Your MI manager will help you do that.
ILR still be open even if they've completed the end date of the apprenticeship but hasn't passed the maths. That's what you're saying. They're still
the maths and English. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And I had another question about loans bursary, but it might apply to the other funding streams as well. Can you claim for assistive technology, hardware and software through the loans bursary? The details seem to vanish from the guidance document, says David Price.
I mean, I think you've raised a very good question there. I think the issue that we've all got is that when it comes to additional support, the best guidance we used to have was the old learning and skills guide about what is an eligible learning support cost. And if it's, for example, assistive technology, the argument would be, is that if the learner didn't have an additional need, would you have spent that money? The answer is no. You can claim a proportion of it because the assumption is that if it's like an iPad or something like that, that's got a depreciation of over 3 years, you couldn't put the full cost of the assistive technology or the iPad or the hardware against it. You'd have to do a proportion of it. If the assistive technology is only going to be used by that one learner, it's not going to be retained, then you could put all of that against it. So it's the additional cost element. In other words, if the learner did not have that need, would you have spent that money on them? Yeah.
That makes sense, yeah. And one last question, which is a sort of more general one, which I missed earlier. It's a 42-day question. So you've been supporting a learner for within the first 6 weeks, 42 days, but then that learner has withdrawn and become unfundable. Can we still claim anything from the earnings adjustment statement or the additional learning needs?
I mean, if the person doesn't become a start, if they're still not with you on day 42, and after, they're not a start, you can't claim any learning support.
You can't claim anything.
The learner has got to be eligible to be funded, and there's got to be a start to be funded.
Yeah,
so if they leave you before day 42,
all those additional support costs you put in at the beginning.
Now, if they were on a program that was less than a month long, right, in other words, you planned it for less than a month, you would make all of that. You can't claim that through the ILR. You'd have to do all of that through the earnings adjustment statement. And I think we've got that on the earnings adjustment statement, haven't we? That if you've got someone who's less than where a program is less than 1 month long, but the problem is withdrawal is not the same as a program of less than 1 month long. Do you know what I mean? In other words, you've planned for it to be less than 1 month long. You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
If the learner didn't get to day 42, then you can't claim the funding, because they haven't become a start. Okay? And that's just an example of how we've been using learning support earnings, the earnings adjustment. I think that's a real apprentice, yeah, it's one of our level 2 business studies apprentices. The other thing, I've just made a few notes on access to work. How many of you are using access to work to support people on AB or on apprenticeships? Got a few of you. I mean, you know that now the maximum grant is significantly higher than it was a few years ago at 59,200. The biggest use of that in my organisation is supported internships. So we're using this to get people into apprenticeships, and this is mostly 19 to 24s. But we're also using it with apprentices where, you know, they cannot undertake the apprenticeship without special adaptations, etc. So sometimes, you know, it's worth having a look at access to work. I know it's a much more complex, and it's very, very administratively burdensome. But you know, sometimes it's worth looking at because it will give you the additional funds. However, sometimes by taking out access to work, you actually then will make the person less than high needs because the remaining support costs are less than 6,000. This is particularly with 19 to 25-year-olds with education health care plans where it's affected us. But of course, between access to work and the learning support cost that we got through, what do you call it, the 16 to 19 funding formula, it still gives us the right amount of funding. So again, supported internships are very important for us in terms of progression to apprenticeships. So we've got a few of you using access to work. We had a couple of comments there I could see. Yeah, far too real pain. I know. And I think for apprentices, a whole lot of issues have been raised about why not enough money is being claimed by providers. It's a lack of awareness. It's the administrative problems. It's most providers and employers were aware that learning support and disadvantage funding were available, but weren't aware of things like excess support, exceptional support, or access to work. And also, they're still using the old categories: additional learning needs, additional social needs. We've got rid of those categories now with learning support. And as I said, really, they've often ignored the fact that learning support would help people get through the endpoint assessment, helps with progression, etc. So this is the sort of information that a lot of apprenticeship providers and employers would now welcome. And we've asked the ESFA that it certainly makes that information much more readily available for not just us, the providers, it's the employers, because you can only support an apprentice as well as the employer who employs them, who recognises that that person, to achieve their apprenticeship framework or standard, needs additional support. And of course, some of your apprentices might not want the employer to also know that they need that additional support. That's another dilemma for you. So these are some of the things that that providers and employers would welcome, and especially, you know, I think it would help us as well. So hopefully from today, you will say, right, I've got a greater awareness of Block 2 disadvantage funding. I've got a greater awareness of the earnings adjustment statement. Loan funded learners should be supported through that facility, get that sorted out, the loans bursary fund. And also all apprentices should have access to learning support. If that's being done by another group of people, make sure that you are aware of what they're doing if you don't directly control that. It's all coming out of the ESFA's total budgets. So can you make sure that you have a clarity of, this is from inspection, clarity of policy, procedures and plans for how learning support is being provided, not just for high needs learners, this is extending to all your learners, who's responsible for it, including those that are work-based, including what's the role of the employer, because remember the employer might flag up that some of their apprentices have got needs. Make sure the resources then match up with what you intend to do, how you record it, how you track it, all of the stuff to do with assessment, and then have a clarity of your ALS implementation plan with funding attached to it. If you're going to do X hours of classroom support, how much is that going to support? If you're going to do one-to-one, how much is that going to support? If you're going to put in specialist support for endpoint assessment, how much is that going to cost? And wherever necessary, collaborate with your specialist partners. I know we work with some of the specialist institutions that are listening in today, where we can, for example, access that these different sources of funding, where we've got learners that are we're sharing in terms of their programs, where the placement might be, where the person's with a specialist provider, but doing some of their work externally through subcontracting. And last but not least, to make sure we know what the impacts of all of this are. Hopefully that's helped you. If you've got any further needs, further questions, particularly about high needs funding, get in touch with Claire, get in touch with us at eMemoir. You've got my email address directly there, and we're quite happy to answer those questions.
Thank you, Beej. That's fantastic. We have one more question. We might have a couple more. Let me just double check. So I've got one from Karen here. Is there any guidance on using access to work for apprentices, please? I know that a lot of people have difficulty with access to work.
I've not picked up that, Claire, that question.
So, sorry, is there any guidance on using access to work for apprentices?
If you go back to the access to work guidance documents, which you'll get from Job Centre Plus, it does actually specify the types of help that can be funded out of access to work for those people about to start a job, those who are on a work trial, and those who are self-employed. And that also includes self-employed and employed apprentices as well. So I think you can have a look at all of those, for example, where you've had to make adaptations, etc. So have a look, because as long as they're eligible, as long as they're publicly funded, and as long as that you're willing to go through all the administrative pain of getting the learner to apply for access to work funding with your support, then I think you're okay. And that includes, by the way, you notice not only the job coaching, but also awareness training for colleagues. So I think the main thing there is that a lot of we've had a little bit going into those who are apprentices. Most of it has gone into the pre-apprenticeship programs, but similar conditions apply. Okay, I think that's it, Claire.
I think that's all the questions. Thanks once again, Beej, and apologies to everyone that we've gone slightly over, but hopefully you found it helpful. Please get in touch with either myself or Beej with any questions. I have now put the slides in the handout pane, but we will also be emailing it to you, all of the people that registered for the webinar. I think that's it. Thank you very much. It's been great, and we will hopefully see you all again soon. Thanks a lot.